Hey guys, what's up? Mr. Castro here. Just want to go over some of the stuff that we're going to be going over in the American pageant. Again, we're going to go kind of chapter by chapter, but some of the stuff we'll cover together. Maybe some of the different chapters, right? We'll address some of the questions in class. So again, just to be able to do this, right, so that you guys can actually listen to the lectures, maybe even get some sleep off my voice, like I said to you guys. But just to kind of give you a little bit of a head start, right, with some of the stuff that we're discussing. So one of the very first things, right, that you guys read about and we'll be discussing just briefly, right, it's just kind of a little bit of background, right, about North America. So again, this idea that recorded history began about 6,000 years ago. 500 years ago, Europeans arrived on the American continent, right? So, you know, you're talking about a 5,500-year period between, like, recorded history, right, and the coming of the European. So again, there's this theory, right, that of Pangaea, that this supercontinent existed 250 million years ago. A lot of the geological forces that happened because of that shaped the old Rockies and the Appalachian Mountains. But then again, one of the things that's really going to be important to us is the Great Ice Age, right, that took place about 10,000 years ago. So here's, again, a picture of Pangaea, right? You can see anywhere between 225 to 250 million years ago, right? And then again, sort of the breaking off to the continents that we have today. And of course, the Ice Age, like I said, right? Of course, obviously the cartoon, but everybody remembers it this way. But the Ice Age is going to be really important, right? Because it really does help in terms of the peopling of the Americas, because that's what the chapter is really about, right? Is that some of the different groups of people that were here. So again, as you can see on the map, you can see sort of the area that was covered in ice. And so when we look at what we are discussing in class, right, some of the things that we are going to be discussing, right, is this area here, right? So what's going to happen, right, is, again, there's this theory, right, by historians like archaeologists, anthropologists, right, that mankind originated right here, and then over time what ends up happening, right, is you have people that migrated this way, and then people that migrated this way, and then migrated all the way right across, and then over the next 5,000 years or so, right, we think that people did this, and then they just kept migrating down. And so again, people of the indigenous people of the Americas are essentially, right, descendants of people that are Asian. So again, the diminishing ice age, right, revealed the land bridge between present-day Alaska and Siberia. So about 35,000 years ago, right, groups came in 3 stages over the next 25,000 years. So we're talking about nomadic hunters and gatherers, right? So again, when we say nomadic hunters and gatherers, we're talking about that being their economic system, right? And so their economic system, like we talked about, right, that leads to the social system, which means, again, they organized in tribes, which makes sense because, again, it's easier to move around this way. So what ends up happening, right, is countless tribes emerge with over 2,000 languages spoken. Some of the most famous of these people, right, of course, are going to be the Inca of Peru, the Maya of Central America, which I am about 29%, and the Aztec of Mexico, right? So these 3 groups of people, right? So the Aztec, okay, the Mayan, and the Inca. These are just the great examples of what ends up happening in terms of culture. So one of the things that I discussed with those of you that were there at the summer writing workshop, right, is that most anthropologists, the majority, I should say, the majority of anthropologists, the majority of scholars, historians, right, archaeologists believe that it was women because they were the gatherers, that it was women who actually discovered agriculture. And as a result, about 5,000 years ago in what is today Mesoamerica, right, or Middle America, right around Central America and Mexico, the Yucatan Peninsula, the tribes began to settle down because they discovered corn, and so maize. Eventually, so again, 5,000 years ago is when that happened then, okay? What ends up happening is it's going to still take, okay, up until 1200 BC or so, right? So a couple thousand years for it to actually make its way into North America. So if you look at that difference, right, in terms of when it was first planted, right, when the agricultural revolution begins, that's how long it took, right? So just think about that, right? I mean, and the way that I kind of want you to think about this is, you know, if we take, when I was your age, if my cousin in Barcelona, if she wanted to see a picture of something that we were doing, right, I'd have to physically send her that picture. I mean, imagine the time that would be spent to doing that. Now I can post on Instagram, and my cousin can instantaneously like it within seconds. I mean, just think about the technology in terms of innovation and the spreading of ideas, right? So here we're talking about 2,000 years for this agricultural revolution to really spread into North America. So some of the people, right, in the what is now essentially above what is Mexico, some of the peoples that settled that area, right, were the Pueblo. Okay, so they were some of the first what we would call American corn growers, right, in their adobe houses, the American Southwest. Again, present-day New Mexico. Eventually, right, with the 1680s, right, we will be talking about Pope's Rebellion. But again, we'll get to that a little bit later. So as we moved, as time passed, right, some of the southeastern tribes, they because of innovation, right, they were able to grow on the already existing agricultural revolution, and they began to diversify their planting, right, and so they started the three sister farming technique, right. So they began to plant corn, beans, and squash, right? So some of the most significant groups were the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, and the Iroquois. And again, we'll come back to these guys later, also because eventually we'll talk about them being part of the 5 civilized tribes. But again, we'll come back to this. So in terms of the Iroquois, right, when we look at present-day state of New York right here, okay, some of the northeastern, right, some of the more complex northeastern groups of people, right, were the Iroquois, right? So they were essentially a confederation. This word is super important, right? This group of 5 tribes from New York, right? They were very matrilineal, which meant that the importance of the woman, right? That the descendants, tribal. Each tribe maintained their own independence, but they belonged to this confederation, right, for defense purposes. And of course, Hiawatha being their legendary leader that hopefully you read about. Okay, the native view of the world, right, was the land was communal. Things were communal, right? When we get into Jamestown a little bit in class, I'm going to show you just a quick scene from the film The New World. Not one of my favorite films, but we'll take a look at this quick scene where a native Powhatan, grabs one of the English tools, and we'll see what happens, right? Because again, the idea that things belong to the tribe versus things being selfishly mine. The native view was also very shamanistic, right? So there was this sort of witch doctor, priestly person, right, who had an explanation of the world. The idea that nature mixed with spirits, right? Everything was sort of tied together, sort of like the Jedi Force. Nature was sacred. No real concept of money, right? Most of the things that they did were barter. And as a result, there was no real concept of greed. And again, we'll elaborate a little bit with that in class. So one of the things that we begin looking at too, right, is that some of the Europeans that begin coming over. The first quote-unquote Europeans to come over were the Norsemen, right? Vikings from Norway, about 1000 A.D. Newfoundland, right, which is today Newfoundland was Vinland. Eric the Red and Leif Erikson were some of the people, right? But again, this part's really what we're looking at in terms of importance, right? Like, why weren't their voyages as important? And one of the things that we've seen with the exam and a little bit of discussion, right, is that there were no city-states. There was just no capital to back up. The European countries were not ready for this. So the Crusades, one of the things that we will talk about a little bit too, right, we'll discuss in class, is the importance that the Crusades play, right? So the European Crusaders, right, they gained a sweet tooth. This is huge, right? So again, they are fighting over Jerusalem, right? The Jews, the Muslims, the Christians, right? Eventually, right, the Muslims will win out. One of the people responsible for that, right, is Salah ad-Din. And again, we'll get into that a little bit more in class. But the real big importance with the Crusades, right, is that the Europeans may not have won the religious war, but they definitely came back to Europe with this thirst, right, for things like Eastern spices, gold, and silk. And so they are going to try to seek a passage, right? And so one of the things that we'll see is that at the end of the Crusades, right, they're going to have some choices. So this area here, right, is going to be controlled by the same people that they just fought. Interestingly enough, right, these same people are going to be like, sure, come on through, right? But because we are now the gatekeepers, it's going to cost you some money. And so, when we look at the Europeans, right, the idea of going here, well, that's not going to make any sense, right? Going here is going to cost us money. Going this way, well, there are question marks about what's there. So the only feasible option was to go south, right? But of course, there's this big freaking continent called Africa that's chilling there. And so they're going to have to be ready to be able to voyage around Africa. So 1295 also, Marco Polo and his exaggerated accounts played a big role. So many things begin to become discussed again, right? Things like cost of the land voyage, the northern voyage, western voyage. So again, like I was saying, right, the south. So one of the people that plays a major role is Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal. Okay, he is going to invest heavily in Portuguese trade. So some of the new developments, things like the caraval, the compass, and the astrolabe, right? These are going to play major roles in them being able to go around Africa. Some of the Portuguese explorers that were able to get to the Cape of Good Hope and all the way around. Bartolomé Diaz, 1488, he was the first European to round the Cape of Good Hope, right? So right here. And then Vasco da Gama, right? 1497 was the first European to round the Cape of Good Hope and actually make it all the way around. So this is huge, right? And part of why they were able to do it, right, is because they're able, for the most part, right, to be able to go around Africa and actually, come close to the coast. And eventually that's going to play a big role because they will be trading with some of the African kingdoms. One of the things that we're going to take a look at too, right, is that 90% of the Africans that were brought to the Americas were sold by other Africans. And again, that's really unfortunate, right? So one of the things that we're going to discuss heavily, and you can see that it's kind of cut off a little bit, but I'll explain it to you, right? So one of the things that we're going to discuss heavily, right, is obviously you can see here that for the most part, right, the Africans that ended up in the Americas, right, were from West Africa. So when we look at a lot of quote-unquote African Americans, right, even any of the Africans that live in the Western Hemisphere, right, or people that are descendants of, they tend to have the same genetic makeup as people from West Africa. There's actually a study being done right now in terms of those that ended up here, right, in the United States, and whether or not there's whether they share the same genetic makeup of people from Ghana. So there's some interesting studies that are being done along those lines. And as you can see, right outside of the African continent, the largest group or percentage of African descendants are in Brazil, right? So the role that the Portuguese played. The Iberian cousin, right, Spain wanted a piece of the pie too. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, right, this played a major role, right? Of course, one of the things that they did is the Spanish Inquisition, right? The Spanish Inquisition, for all the religious talk, and again, we'll talk about the dogs of God. For all the religious talk, right, one of the major things that the Inquisition did produce is cash. And now the Spanish crown, what it needed was its glory, right? Its hero, its explorer per se. And so they got this in the form of Christopher Columbus, right? Cristoforo Colombo, right? This Genoese explorer who in October 12th, 1492, right, arrives in the island of San Salvador. And of course we know, right, in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. So Columbus encountered the Arawak and the Taino Indians, right, or the natives, and again, because he thought he had reached India. He also explored Hispaniola and Cuba. He called the natives Indios, right, again, because he thought he had reached India, and then part of it is because he had misjudged the size of the earth. But this is going to have cataclysmic effects, right, in terms of the fact that other Europeans will come. So again, in terms of the importance of Columbus, right, is it a rediscover, or excuse me, a discover or rediscover, right, Columbus versus the Vikings. The Europeans would provide the capital, technology, and the markets, right, to be able to buy the things. Africa would now provide the labor, and the New World would come to provide the raw materials. One of the things that we'll see, of course, is the development of the Columbian Exchange, okay? So things that, from the New World, right, to the Old World, you know, things like corn, the potato. I mean, imagine Ireland without the potato, right? Imagine what's it called? The Italian food without the tomato, right? Interestingly enough, it says peppers here, right? You can see that it says bell and chili peppers, right? And that's because Columbus, when he tasted them, he thought they were like the peppers, like the black pepper that you put on your food. And things like the Old World, right? Interestingly enough, the horse, right? And realistically, now we know that it was a reintroduction of the horse back in. chicken, the honeybee, right? So again, you can see some of the things that go back and forth, and we'll have a little bit of a conversation about some of the things in class. So again, right, you could see it in a different way, right, from the New World to the Old World. And then again, I'll give you a better copy of this so that you guys can have them, where the slide itself, you'll be able to see it. But again, a lot of the same things that we were just discussing. So one of the things that ends up happening, right, is more and more Spaniards began to come to the Americas. One of the things that we begin to see is that the Spanish and the Portuguese began to conflict in terms of who owned this and who owned that, right? So finally, in 1494, the Pope Alexander the Sixth, he obliged with the Treaty of Tordesillas, and basically what it did is it split the world between Spain and Portugal, right? And if you look at it, right, obviously at the end of the day, right, Spain ended up with the better deal. So some of the Spanish conquistadors, you don't have to memorize these things, right? So Vasco Balboa, Pacific Ocean across Panama. Ferdinand Magellan, the first to circumnavigate the globe, although he himself doesn't make it. Ponce de Leon, right, Florida, goes up into Florida trying to find the Fountain of Youth. Hernan Cortez, right, the conquest of the Aztecs in Mexico. And of course, Francisco Pizarro, right, conquest of the Incas of Peru. So one of the things that the Spaniards did, right, very similar to the English, but not necessarily for religious reasons, is they created the encomienda system, right? So the natives were commended with Spanish landlords. The natives would work and be converted to Christianity, right? So it's a form of slavery in a sense, right, that eventually involved the mission system. So one of the things that I'd like to spend a little bit of time also in class, right, is this example, right? The conquest of Mexico. And part of why is because we'll take a listen to a Rage Against the Machine song in class, People of the Sun. And again, we'll make sure that we know, right, who Hernan Cortez was, Tenochtitlan, right, Moctezuma, Doña Marina, Cuauhtemoc, right, Doña Marina being the translator. This is actually from the rotunda in the Capitol building, and what it shows is the Aztecs, greeting the Spaniards. And of course, one of the things that we'll discuss, right, is Moctezuma's view of Cortez and Quetzalcoatl. So, spread of Spain, right? The Spanish Empire stretched from South America through American Southwest. You can see here in the brown. Threats did begin to emerge, though, right? The English, they actually hired an Italian explorer by the name of Giovanni Caboto, who they named John Cabot, to begin to explore. The French, another Italian explorer, Giovanni de Verrazano. We'll talk about Verrazano and the Verrazano Bridge in New York. France, Jacques Cartier and the St. Lawrence River. And then also France with Robert de La Salle and the Mississippi. But again, we'll get into that a little bit more later too. But the importance of that, right? So they responded with the presidios, the forts, beginning to protect their acquisitions, right? The oldest permanent European settlement is St. Augustine, Florida in 1565, again to protect the Spanish territories. Don Juan de Onate and the Pueblo, right? Beginning again to fortify some of these areas. And again, like I told you guys, right, we'll come back to Pope's Rebellion in 1680. Also, what you can see here, right, is the development of the mission system, right? So the California missions, and many of the missions, of course, were protected by presidios also, right? If you go to San Francisco, for example, there is the presidio. Again, one of the last things I will discuss with this chapter, right, is this Black Legend, right? That the notion that the Spaniards only brought murder, disease, and slavery to the New World. But they also brought a system of law and architecture, Christianity, and language, right? And we'll kind of we'll have a balanced conversation in class about positives and negatives, right, in terms of what happened surrounding this. So again, this concludes the lecture on Chapter 1. I'm going to also put up Chapter 2 and Chapter 3 possibly tonight, but Chapter 2 for sure. So I'm going to put this up and you guys can check it out. All right, guys.